Episode 71. It's Lindsay Grant? Bessy shook her head and continued reading. Nothing. Paul said, "Don't act like your IQ is higher than mine. Your exam score is less than 1/3 of mine." But of course, he didn't dare to say this sentence out loud. The following day after class, Bessy and Mary went to the bookstore in the city after school. Mrs. Lewis had arranged a new exercise book and they would discuss it tomorrow. "We have to transfer to another bus." Bessy held her phone to her ear and said to Michael while getting off the bus, "Wait for me for another 20 minutes. The two of them had to turn a corner to reach another bus stop. While walking in front, Mary stopped suddenly. Bessy hung up the phone and raised an eyebrow. There was a group of 7 or 8 powerful men in front. It was nearly November and wasn't hot anymore, so people wore coats. But these men only wore vests and had large tattoos on their exposed arms and shoulders, making them look very sinister and scary. They were even holding steel knives and sticks in their hands and looked like gangsters at first glance. Mary paused and took a step back involuntarily. She felt slightly uneasy as she turned to look at Bessy. "Our boss wants to see you." The man in front bit his cigarette and stared at Bessy casually. "This chick is even from Brightbow High School. What an outstanding student." "I don't want to see him. Make way. Thank you," Bessy said as she tucked her phone in her pocket. She stared at the gangsters, lowered her voice and replied concisely. She saw that Mary was nervous, so she reached out and patted her shoulder reassuringly. "It's the car just in front of the street." The gangster took a step forward and pointed to a sports car parked on the street imposingly. Bessy looked up and clenched her fists. Her voice was very gentle as she said, "It seems like you don't understand me." Chicago's bookstore. It occupied several floors of the mall. Marvin was standing by a row of bookshelves, holding a cell phone and talking to the person on the other end. "I'm not sure about the 129 case. I just came back to Chicago recently. You'll have to ask Samuel." The other end replied. Marvin's face was stiff as he looked in Michael's direction. Michael was standing in front of a row of shelves, looking seriously at some high school revision materials. Occasionally, he would even take one out and flip through it. He was quiet and focused, and a few girls who had been shopping here still hadn't left.
"What's Michael doing?"
the person on the other end asked. Marvin wiped his face and said in despair, "Grandpa Clark, trust me, you don't want to know." Marvin said a few more words before hanging up. Then, he picked up the basket on the side, followed respectfully behind Michael, and put his selected books in the basket. Marvin stared at the pile of things in the basket. He thought to himself expressionlessly, who knew that Michael, who was almost omnipotent in the capital, was now in a bookstore in Chicago, seriously choosing materials for the college entrance examination. "Grandpa Clark?" Michael put a book into the basket and asked. Marvin nodded. He wanted to inquire about the lone wolf. "When the lone wolf took our order last time, there was an enormous wave over the capital." "Only our order was taken?" Michael looked over expressionlessly. "That's what Grandpa Clark said. He has been hiding for a year and only took our order." Marvin lowered his voice and continued. "Many people in Evanston are investigating us now. However, 129 had done well and had not leaked any information." Michael narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. He picked up another college entrance exam review book, glancing through the content page. The bookstore was full of lights, but it wasn't glaring on his cold white fingers. He looked down and flipped through the book casually, looking very lazy. However, he exuded a sense of elegance that made people stay a distance away. This was one reason why the girls from not far away didn't dare come forward to flirt with him. Michael didn't have to wait long before Bessy and Mary arrived. "I've got the 2 review books for you." Michael motioned to the basket that Marvin was holding and said to Bessy. Then he paused and continued. "I got you other review books as well." Bessy stared at the Mathematics Advanced Plan book that was placed on top of the basket. After a while, she said tiredly, "Okay." Michael had already walked around the bookstore and was done, so he turned and asked, "Is there anything you 2 want to buy?" When he turned, his eyes naturally flickered past Bessy, and he noticed her wrinkled sleeve. "Mary still wants to get 2 more books. Wait here for a while. I'll get them with her." Bessy didn't let Michael follow them. Michael was cold and, like most people, Mary felt nervous when she saw him. "Okay, I'll go to the cash register first." Michael nodded and led Marvin away. Marvin put the basket in his hand on the cash register and waited for Mary and Bessy.
Marvin, find a way to ask Mary.
Michael leaned lazily against the cash register, his hand pressed against his lips as he whispered,
Did anything happen to them when they came here? Okay.
Marvin nodded and didn't doubt Michael's instructions. On the other side, Mary turned and looked at the books on the bookshelf. She pursed her lips and couldn't hold back. Bessy, what's your relationship with Mr. Clark? Bessy thought for a while and said, He's my employer. Mary didn't say anything. It didn't seem like so. But she kept quiet. Mary took 2 of the books she wanted, and Bessy also took a few foreign language books. Michael obviously wouldn't pay at the cash register himself, so Marvin just stayed stiffly there, but he was extremely serious. Otherwise, Michael wouldn't take him out on business trips anymore. Marvin took Bessy and Mary's books and paid for them. When he handed the last few books to the cashier, Marvin paused. He glanced at the book in his hand. It was in German. Because he minored in German at Patrick Clark University, he recognized the language and realized it was a book of poems. He looked down and there was another English book.
Miss Miller, did you take the wrong book?
Marvin pulled out the books and asked Bessy. Bessy glanced at them. No, I didn't.
Okay.
Marvin nodded. He wasn't much of a talker. He guessed that Bessy probably bought these for someone else, or pretended to use it. Almost at the same time, in a restaurant in Chicago.
Chairwoman Grant, this is our proposal.
The old man's face was gentle, and his slightly cloudy eyes still shone slightly as he pushed a folder to him.
Look.
The woman on the opposite side wore a black suit. She had short hair and was dressed meticulously. She was Gerald Grant's sister, Lindsay Grant. Lindsay Grant put her hands on the document but didn't read it. Instead, she looked up and said, Mr. Smith, you should know that I talked to your son 2 days ago. There are so many enterprises in Chicago, but I still like the Smith family. The 2 of them conversed. There was a knock on the door. It was Lindsay's secretary. She was holding Lindsay's private phone with a look of panic. My apologies. Lindsay smiled. Daryl Smith picked up his tea and smiled.
No worries.
Chairwoman Grant. The secretary said little, but her expression was bad as she directly handed the phone to Lindsay. Antonio is in the hospital. Bang. Lindsay pulled her chair back immediately and stood up. Her expression drastically changed. What? She grabbed her bag and rushed out. They had just been talking about cooperation, and it wasn't suitable for Daryl to just leave now, so he also followed her to the hospital. After an hour, the Smith family sat at the dining table. They had been extremely quiet these days. Grace was in a trance and was thinking about something. The phone in the living room rang. This was strange, as the Smith family had their individual phones, and very few people called their house number. Aunt Ruth wiped her hands, looked at the caller ID and picked up politely. Mr. Smith. Aunt Ruth's expression faded.
What's wrong?
David glanced over while holding his fork. Aunt Ruth frowned and said respectfully to David, It's your dad, and he seems pretty anxious. David put down his fork with a serious expression when he heard that it was his father. He took the phone from Aunt Ruth and then said something to Daryl.
Thomas, go up, change your clothes, and come out with me.
David hung up and said solemnly. Thomas was halfway through his meal, but he put down his fork after hearing this. He knew that it wasn't a small matter, so he got up and asked while heading upstairs.
Dad, what happened? Chairwoman Grant's son is in the hospital.
David frowned. Lindsay's business wanted to expand, and several families in Chicago were greedily trying to cooperate with her. It wasn't easy for the Smith family to get this opportunity to cooperate, so they shouldn't make a mistake now. Antonio had been injured, and it was only right that they visited him in the hospital. More than half an hour later, the 2 of them arrived at the hospital. Daryl stood in the corridor along with several people in the industry. They exchanged conventional greetings, but were obviously divided at heart.
Dad, what's the situation?
David approached and asked in a low voice. Daryl glanced at the ward, his cloudy eyes secretive.
That Antonio just got beaten in Chicago. We have yet to sign the contract with the Grant family. Beaten in Chicago?
Thomas raised his eyebrow in surprise.
Who is so bold to dare to beat him on the Grant family's territory?
Not to mention Gerald Grant, but the people in Chicago didn't dare to touch Lindsay either. Daryl shook his head unknowingly.
A few local gangsters also got beaten along with him.
The three of them were talking when the next door's ward was pushed open. It wasn't Lindsay who came out, but Lindsay's assistant. The group of people hurried over. Lindsay's assistant greeted them one by one, and then she looked over to Daryl and paused before saying, "Chairman Smith, I wonder if you know this person?" Her expression was strange. Daryl had doubts in his heart.
Who?
"It's a girl named Bessy Miller from Bright Bow High School." Lindsay's assistant narrowed her eyes. Episode 72. Bessy fought someone? Daryl was about to say something, but David looked up and said solemnly,
"What's the matter?"
"I won't hide it from you. I heard from Chairwoman Grant that she was the one who beat Antonio." She nodded slightly towards David and then left. David's expression was solemn. Daryl narrowed his eyes at the two of them.
"Who's Bessy?"
David had long been separated from the Smith family. When Grace had brought Bessy back, she had warned Bessy but had failed to inform Daryl. After all, Bessy wasn't an important person. David didn't report such trivial matters to his father, so it was natural that he didn't know who Bessy was until now. After listening to David's explanation, Daryl's face sank.
"This Bessy doesn't seem to know her place. Unlike Anne, what do you intend to do?"
Daryl finally spoke after a long pause.
"This matter is probably not her fault. That Antonio had long taken a fancy to her."
David paused and then sighed.
"Dad, don't worry. I don't plan on recognizing her as my stepdaughter."
When Anne first came to the Smith family, the whole family recognized her and even held a banquet. But when Bessy came, David had no such plans because of various considerations. Bessy didn't know that she had caused several changes because of her actions. At this time, she was in the school doctor's office. Today, there was no examination during self-study, and very few people actually came. Marvin brewed a cup of tea for her and placed it beside her. He couldn't help but give Bessy another glance when he saw her holding the German book. Bessy flipped a page and then looked up. "What's wrong?"
"Nothing. I thought you were asleep."
Marvin couldn't help but say, "I'm reading." Bessy supported her chin with her hand and replied lazily,
"Really?"
Marvin glanced at her book in disbelief. It was mainly because he had done such a thing before in school as well. He had bought more than a dozen criminal investigation books and put them in the dorm room. But in fact, he had never read a single page. Marvin walked away silently and continued to brew tea. Michael glanced at him and suddenly remembered something. He knocked on the table with his hand and looked at Bessy.
"Have you ever considered changing your part-time job?"
Bessy guessed that he was talking to her, so she looked up and asked casually, "Change my job?" Michael took the tea beside him and took a sip slowly. He said in a light tone,
"A job as a technician. We still lack a technician in Chicago."
"Huh?" Bessy stopped reading, leaned back against her chair, and raised an eyebrow.
"It's better than your coffee shop job."
Michael was very patient with her. Bessy touched her chin with one hand and smiled at him. Her eyebrows were delicate and cool. "Is there pay?" Michael paused and stared at Bessy for a few seconds, expressionlessly.
"How are your computer skills?"
"Average." Bessy was very modest. She probably didn't even know that her eyebrows showed her self-confidence when she said this. Michael put the teacup down and leaned on the back of the chair, chuckling.
"Average is fine."
Samuel heard that she was interested and came over to pull a chair and sit down.
"I give you the green light."
Marvin's hand trembled and he almost overturned the teapot in his hand. He glanced subconsciously at Samuel. The green light? It's not possible. Bessy looked away with a lack of interest. This stuff is boring.
"Bessy, you only get one chance. Do you know how many people are lining up in Chicago to enter?"
Samuel raised his eyebrow and persuaded her. "I won't hide the truth from you, but many people in Evanston want me to join them." Bessy propped her legs up. Samuel choked and asked mysteriously,
"Do you know the Hacker Alliance? I can bring you in."
"Oh." Bessy picked up her book in disinterest. "I know. Yeah, right."
"Fine."
Samuel choked again. He leaned his head on the table and turned sideways to Michael.
"Michael, I can't do it. It's your turn."
Michael nodded and then thought it was too cold, so he yawned and explained.
"Don't be so anxious. There will be many opportunities in the future. The most important thing for high school students is to study."
Bessy glanced at him sideways and agreed deeply. I also think I should study hard. Samuel ground his teeth.
Yes, you should study hard. You might even score a few points.
Marvin stared blankly at them. He didn't dare to speak. He only dared to pick up his phone. He sent out a tweet.
Do you know that someone actually rejected Samuel's internal invitation? If she knows about what she has refused, would she want to go back and strangle herself today?
After ranting, he found that there was no response. Marvin kept his phone, his face still and stiff as always, but he couldn't help but stare at Bessy. Was this girl born with a few missing brain cells? After spending so much time with Samuel and Michael, didn't she feel like their identities were far from normal? Bessy continued reading her book. But Michael thought of something and glanced at Marvin. Marvin followed Michael out of the school doctor's office and stopped in the courtyard.
Mary said that Miss Miller seemed to have fought with someone.
Marvin knew what Michael wanted to ask and whispered to him first. Michael took out a cigarette and narrowed his eyes slightly.
Fight? With whom?
I don't know the name. Marvin shook his head. Michael nodded.
Okay, go in first.
Early the next morning. Grace saw him when David got up the next morning. She found Daryl sitting in the living room downstairs. It shocked Grace senseless. She went downstairs rigidly and folded her hands subconsciously.
What has brought you here? I came mainly to deal with your daughter's affairs.
Daryl's eyes narrowed imposingly. Grace felt a chill on her spine. The old man had always called Anne by her name, and the words, your daughter, were full of deep displeasure. Almost without thinking, Grace knew that Bessy had caused trouble again. When Bessy received a phone call from Thomas, she had yet to finish her lesson. Bessy opened the bathroom door and sat on the toilet seat.
What do you mean? I'm going to be killed?
Bessy tucked her headphones into her ear and pulled the cord subconsciously. She counted with her fingers how many people wanted to kill her. Those people existed, but they were absolutely reluctant to kill themselves. Thomas looked up at the car outside and said in a light voice,
It's the Grant family. You won't even know if I tell you. Anyway, I've already taken leave for you. Come out first and I'll wait for you outside the school gate. Grandpa will help you resolve this matter.
Thomas didn't know that Bessy had beaten someone up, but he was clear that Lindsay wanted to crush a high school student in Chicago, so it wasn't easy for him to retaliate. He could only let Grandpa resolve it first, and then, regarding the business deal with the Grant family, it was probably gone. Bessy sat on the toilet seat and thought for a long time before she finally remembered Antonio. Although her temper was bad, she wasn't the kind who liked to hit people, so she hadn't hit them hard yesterday. Antonio and the others could get up after resting in bed for 2 days. But she didn't expect Thomas to find her. Antonio probably played a critical role in the interests of the Smith family, and Bessy understood this key point. She took her phone and sent Mary a message, saying that she wouldn't be returning to class. Then she went to find Thomas. She wasn't afraid of Antonio, but was afraid of implicating Mary. Bessy and Thomas arrived at the hospital before 9 o'clock. Thomas took her directly to the ward. The ward door closed and Grandpa Smith was in the corridor. When she arrived, Grace followed her with a flower basket.
Listen to Elise. You have to practice the violin, so you can't be distracted.
Grandpa Smith looked at Anne and nodded slightly. Anne pursed her lips and didn't dare to say anything. She didn't have much contact with Grandpa Smith and only knew that he was the impressive person who had founded the Smith family by hand. In front of Grandpa Smith, even Grace didn't dare to say or do anything. Thomas came in with Bessy.
Grandpa, this is my sister Bessy.
Bessy only realized now that Grandpa Smith was in the Smith family. She greeted him politely. Grandpa Smith. Before he had seen her, Grandpa Smith had heard multiple versions of Bessy. He looked her up and down. The little girl was wearing her school jacket, with her sleeves rolled up and her face slightly raised. Her facial features were better than Anne's, but there was a sense of arrogance. Grandpa Smith responded slightly in an icy voice, and then turned to look at Thomas.
Okay, wait outside for me. I'll go in with Thomas.
Grandpa Smith's attitude towards Bessy was not warm. Anne lowered her head and concealed her smirk. But this was to be expected. Why would Grandpa have good feelings towards her when she just disturbed a big business deal? Grace found an opportunity to walk to Bessy and said anxiously,
"Why did you beat up Mr. Gomez? Do you know that Lindsay Grant has connections with the gangsters and can kill you whenever she wants to?"
Grace had heard all this when Anne had checked on the information of the Grant family just now. Grace didn't know much about this world. In her eyes, Gerald Grant and the Grant family were outstanding figures and had deep connections in Chicago. She had trod in carefully for so many years because she was afraid of offending people. Bessy looked at her phone, lowered her head, and didn't speak. Grace still wanted to say something, but she saw Grandpa Smith coming out with Chairwoman Grant. Lindsay looked extremely lethargic, but it didn't conceal her imposing aura. Anne was very polite and obedient. "Chairwoman Grant." Lindsay's sharp eyes glanced at her, then she looked away and ignored her.
"Other than Mr. Gomez, this Grant family is full of proud and arrogant people, so only Grandpa can talk to her,"
Thomas whispered and explained to Bessy. Lindsay knew her son's virtue and didn't intend to delve into it. She was just about to let Grandpa Smith and the others leave. But when she glanced over at Bessy, she paused. "You're Miss Miller?" Episode 73. Your Daughters Are Outstanding. Everyone in the corridor focused on Lindsay. They all looked at her when she paused. Grandpa Smith didn't expect Lindsay to stop so suddenly. He thought that she had discovered that it was Bessy who had hit Antonio, so he turned sideways and frowned deeply. David had told him that Bessy was rebellious, so he hoped that she wouldn't cause trouble again. Grandpa Smith stared at Bessy with a solemn face. Lindsay was a career woman, and her eyebrows were thick even though she didn't deliberately touch upon them. Her eyebrows converged with a rare sharpness that other people didn't have, and she even held a cigarette in her hand. When she looked over, Grace's heart jumped, and she was shocked. Anne had just been ignored by Lindsay and was feeling depressed, but when she saw her staring at Bessy, she pursed her lips and covered the smirk on her face. "Do I know you?" Bessy put away her phone slowly and narrowed her eyes slightly at Lindsay. After thinking for a while, she still couldn't think of any relevant memory. Lindsay subconsciously pinched the cigarette in her hand, smiled and said in a light voice, "You may not know me, but I've seen your photos." Her title as the Queen of Hell of the Grant family made everyone in the financial market tremble in fear. She did as she pleased, so everyone who discussed business with Lindsay knew how difficult she was to deal with. That could be seen from the way she had ignored Anne and Grace. But now that she was talking to Bessy, although her voice wasn't considered gentle, it was much better than when she had talked to Grandpa Smith. "You failed to recognize a familiar person." Lindsay smiled at Grandpa Smith and wasn't in a hurry to leave. She turned around and opened the door of the ward, letting everyone in before saying amiably, "Come in." There was no sharp edge to her tone. Anne stood at the side and froze, the irony and joy on her face disappearing after a few seconds. Grace stood on the spot and looked at Lindsay like she was a different person. She also turned her head and saw that Bessy's expression was also shocked. Other than these two, even a well-informed man like Grandpa Smith also didn't expect this development. He looked up with deep eyes and said, "Chairwoman Grant, this—" Grandpa Smith wasn't overreacting. From yesterday to now, many people visited Antonio, but only a few people could enter the room. Grandpa Smith had gone in for less than a minute before Lindsay had brought him out. This showed Lindsay's serious attitude towards this matter. It was so easy for her to enter now.
"Mom."
One of Antonio's eyes was bruised. He was lying on the bed playing with his phone when he saw Bessy and the others enter. He stared and pointed at her.
She...
Lindsay reached out and pressed his finger back, then slapped him on the head again and pressed his forehead. "What? Hurry and apologize to Miss Miller." Antonio was shocked. "What? Miss Miller? Antonio stuttered. "You what?" Lindsay let go of his hand and sneered. "You only know how to mess around all day. Look at yourself. How are you worthy of Miss Miller? You're chasing someone out of your league. Hurry up and apologize to Miss Miller."
"I'm sorry."
Antonio touched his head.
"Although I was in the wrong, you beat us up too, so we're even."
"Even?" Lindsay crossed her arms, stood at the foot of the bed and said ironically to Antonio,
You'll know how light Miss Miller hit you once your dad comes over. Antonio wasn't afraid of anything other than his father, and his expression changed drastically. Mom, what does this have to do with Dad? Lindsay glanced at him in good spirits and didn't bother explaining to him. She turned to face Bessy and became gentle again. Miss Miller, if I had known that this kid had been harassing you, I would have dragged him over to apologize to you. Did he cause trouble for you? I didn't, Antonio shouted. Bessy dug into her ear and glanced at them before finally focusing on Lindsay. She was silent for a few seconds before she said politely, Oh, so Chairwoman Grant is from Captain Gomez's family. Just call me Aunt Lindsay. Lindsay smiled softly. While the two of them spoke, the remaining 4 people in the ward were frozen like sculptures. Lindsay invited Bessy to dinner, but she rejected her and turned her head. I'll talk about this matter with Captain Gomez later. I still have class, so I'll go back first. Lindsay led her to the door and wanted to send her downstairs, but Bessy stopped her. When Lindsay returned to the ward, she was confronted with a strange atmosphere inside. Mr. Smith, you should have told me that you were a relative of Miss Miller. Lindsay said with a rare smile. Miss Miller saved Juan last time, and her computer skills far exceed that of an average person. I didn't expect her to be a part of your Smith family. Lindsay's praise was unabashed. Her computer skills? Mr. Smith didn't know what she meant. Grace returned to her senses and looked up. Yes, she restored a video last time. Miss Miller is very impressive. Lindsay took out another cigarette, lit it, and took a puff. It would be nice if she could enter my company in the future. This sentence shocked Grandpa Smith even more. It would be her honor to join the Grant Corporation. Lindsay looked at Grandpa Smith in shock. Is something wrong with what I said? Grandpa Smith didn't understand why she was shocked. Lindsay withdrew her gaze and mumbled, Nothing. After being sent out by Lindsay, Grandpa Smith still didn't understand the meaning behind Lindsay's shock. They went down in silence. Grandpa Smith moved his lips and looked at Grace with a kind expression. I didn't expect Bessy to know Chairwoman Grant. This helped save us a lot of trouble. Have they known each other for a long time? After coming to the Smith family for so many years, it overwhelmed Grace that she was treated so kindly by Grandpa Smith for the first time. I'm not sure. Grace was also confused. Since the last time Bessy had recovered the surveillance footage, Grace had discovered that her daughter seemed different from what she had thought. She never knew that Bessy would know someone like Lindsay. Why did Bessy never tell her? It's good that she knows her. You're very blessed. Your daughters are exceedingly outstanding. Grandpa Smith was full of smiles. Thomas wasn't clear about the surveillance footage matter and asked Grace in a low voice. Grace was flustered at being talked to so politely by the Smith family. Anne followed behind them with a forceful smile. She didn't know what other expressions she could use to cover up her distorted heart. She listened to Grandpa Smith, Thomas, and Grace talking about Bessy continuously and almost went crazy with jealousy. Since the last time, she found that Grace was always involuntarily distracted and subconsciously paid attention to news about Bessy and Thomas. Now there was Lindsay as well. If Lindsay recruited Bessy into the Grant Corporation and was hired, then what position would she fall in the Smith family? Anne only felt like Lindsay's sentence had been to recruit Bessy, but she didn't know that Lindsay had never thought of that from beginning to end. Where did she have the courage to hire Bessy? But Anne only thought of it this way and felt her heart aching terribly. Bessy didn't know what Anne and the others were thinking. She went to visit Bertha on the way out. Before she entered, she went to find Bertha's attending doctor. The attending doctor was a middle-aged man who was looking through his cases at the moment. Are you a family member of patient Bertha? When Bessy came in, he put down his documents and pointed to the chair opposite. Sit. Bessy sat opposite and put her hand on the edge of the table. Doctor, my grandma has been in low spirits recently. Her indicators are failing. The doctor pursed his lips. I can only do my best. Bessy's fingertips struck the table slowly and her eyes deepened. She had always been unbridled and casual as if nothing could stop her, but when she stopped talking in such a serious manner, she was quite imposing. Bertha's attending doctor didn't dare to look her squarely in the eyes. If you need anything, just tell me. Bessy retracted her hands and pressed her temple. Then she coughed lightly and said, You have my mobile number, so you can call me directly if anything happens. Okay.
The attending doctor nodded. Bessy took her phone and left. The attending doctor looked at Bessy's back and felt strange. She was just a high school student, but he was breathless when facing her as compared to David. Bessy left the hospital and walked to the street. She took out her phone and dialed a number. The person picked up after 2 rings. Daniel Brown still looked good, and he raised his eyebrow in surprise.
Why did you find me suddenly?
Bessy bought a bottle of water from the vending machine and took a sip before calmly asking, "Are you still in the Middle East?"
Yeah.
Daniel found a cool place and continued,
Are you all right?
"No." Bessy lowered her eyes and said in a light voice, "I want you to come back and see my grandma." Humans grew old and there was no return. Daniel stared at Bessy and swallowed his words before laughing.
Okay, I'll go back quickly once I'm done.
Bessy put the lid on her water bottle. "Thanks."
It's a small thing.
Daniel smoked a cigarette and said vaguely,
But you have to cover my whereabouts. Many people in the country are investigating me.
"Don't worry about that." Bessy threw away the water bottle in her hand and said slowly, "With me around, nobody can trace you." Although her words were absent-minded, the sense of unbridled wildness almost poured out of her.
You should take it easy too.
Daniel shook his head and chuckled.
Find an organization to join quickly. You're still young and daring, but I might not be able to get you out if you get caught by someone.
Bessy glanced at the camera. Her black hair fell over her brow bones, and she said with her eyes closed, "Let them come at me." Episode 74. Fall Silent. When Bessy arrived at school, it was only 10:30. Thomas had given her a morning off. Bessy was feeling annoyed while holding her phone. She got off the bus and covered the sun with her hand. Her lips pursed tightly. She thought about it and didn't head to class, but turned the corner to walk towards the school doctor's office instead. The school medical office. Harvey sat on a chair casually and threw a stack of documents on the table. Marvin picked them up and looked at them, then knocked on the door and sent it to Michael. When he came back again, Harvey stared at him strangely while leaning against his chair.
Marvin, Michael did that to check on the Grant family?
Marvin glanced at him. Yeah. He hadn't asked who Mary and Bessy had fought with last night, but he was quite clear about the other things. Harvey had just brought over Antonio's details. How bold of him to take a fancy to Bessy.
The Grant family dared to provoke Michael.
Harvey put his hands on his laps, unconvinced.
No, it's because of Miss Miller.
Marvin turned over a few pages and continued.
She fought with Antonio. I heard rumors that they will look for her today.
Harvey heard this, glanced at Marvin and said in a low voice,
So she's here to find Michael? She can't even handle such a trivial matter and still had to find Michael to help her out? She's no different from those other women then. Why does Michael like her?
Harvey could only think so far. It wasn't his fault. Everyone's reaction would be the same after hearing Marvin's words. Marvin looked up.
No, she didn't say a single word. Michael guessed it himself. She didn't tell Michael?
Harvey was shocked. The two of them were talking. Not far away, a figure approached them. It was noon and Bessy should be in class. Why was she suddenly here? Harvey raised an eyebrow at Marvin.
Look, I was right, wasn't I? That Antonio is indeed difficult to deal with, but it's not wrong to find Michael, is it?
Although Marvin said this, he frowned and felt slightly disappointed. Bessy walked towards the room, slowly. It was nearly November, and the sun was still strong, but it wasn't hot.
Miss Miller, don't you have class?
Marvin thought about it, looked up at her and asked softly. No, I took leave. Bessy's hand was still on the door as she said emotionlessly. Marvin lowered his head and said, Oh. Then he stopped looking at Bessy and pondered over something. His movements were slow and distracting. He was so deep in thought that he didn't pour tea for Bessy. Bessy didn't notice him. The school doctor's office was divided into two. Samuel's consultation office was outside. Inside was a sofa and desk. There was a chair in the corner and a soundproof glass door that separated the room from outside. Bessy dragged a chair and sat down opposite Michael. Michael was looking at a picture of the human body structure and raised his eyes.
Why did you come here?
He looked at his phone, and it was 10:40 a.m. Well, something happened. Bessy put her hand on the table and laid down on it. Her eyes were drooping. Her eyes were droopy and she looked sleepy.
So you came here to sleep?
Michael threw the figure of the human body onto his desk and leaned back.
Are you not attending class, little girl?
Why does a little girl need to go to class? Bessy slowly adjusted her posture and said in a lazy voice, Children are the same if they attend class or not. Marvin pushed the glass door open and heard Bessy. His face was stiff, and he thought to himself that Miss Miller was rather self-aware to know that she would be the same regardless of whether she attended class. Bessy was lying on the table with her eyes squinted sleepily. Michael glanced at her and then turned to Marvin and said in a low voice,
What's the matter?
Marvin didn't speak and just glanced subconsciously at Bessy. He had come regarding Bessy.
Go out first, I'll come out later.
Michael lowered his voice. Marvin responded and closed the door behind him. Michael then turned sideways to look at Bessy, who was lying on the table. Her eyes were drooping lazily, and she didn't seem as casual as before. Something was wrong.
Don't sleep here.
Michael walked to the sofa, picked up his little blanket, and handed it to Bessy. Then he pointed to the sofa and said,
Go there.
Bessy nodded and slowly got up to pick up the blanket in Michael's hands. The weather in November was cold, and Bessy's fingertips felt a little cold when they brushed Michael's palm. Michael frowned slightly. Bessy had just talked about it casually, but she fell asleep soon after pulling the small blanket over her body. Michael gently opened the door and went out. Even with the soundproof glass door, Michael still subconsciously lowered his voice and said with deep eyes,
Check on the Grant family. I won't be able to go for now.
He said this lightly, but the chill in his eyes made Marvin and Harvey shiver. Marvin picked up the file on the side.
Okay.
But Harvey looked up carefully and glanced at Michael, secretly horrified. So he had intended to go personally in the beginning? Both of them went out.
What's wrong? Why are you standing outside?
Samuel came in from outside with a few bottles of water. He had yet to take off his white coat, but had unbuttoned it. As soon as he finished speaking, he saw Bessy from across the glass door. She was lying on the sofa, the black blanket covering her whole body tightly and leaving only a few strands of hair outside. Marvin grabbed the document and subconsciously lowered his voice.
Michael, I'll go out first.
Michael nodded. Once he and Harvey left, Samuel hung up his white coat and sat down on his office chair.
Michael, how is the situation now?
He lifted his chin to gesture inside. It wasn't hot at noon, and Michael leaned against the table as he took out his cigarette and his lighter. He squinted before lighting his cigarette slowly.
What? Don't pretend to be confused.
Samuel smiled and lifted his chin towards the sofa inside.
Bessy. Oh.
Michael bit his cigarette and squinted slightly.
She's still in high school. Don't tell me that you don't know she kept for a year and is an adult already.
Samuel chuckled sullenly. He laughed for a moment before correcting his expression.
But the Clark family might not like it.
How could Samuel not remember how repulsive Bessy had been to Marvin when he first came? Hearing this, Michael chuckled lowly, bit his cigarette and said,
You're thinking too much.
At the same time, at the Smith Corporation, David had been worrying about the Grant family, and his company's affairs had been stacked up. All kinds of documents were waiting for approval and were giving him a headache. Chairman Smith, there is a phone call from the Grant Corporation? The secretary's desk was on the side, and she looked up from her desk. It's about the contract. David was stunned, and he looked up in surprise.
The contract?
Even without the situation with Antonio, it wasn't easy to cooperate with the Grant family. Before David had figured anything out, someone knocked on the office's door. Chairman Smith, Daryl is here.
Dad?
David put down his pen and stood up.
Why are you here? I want to talk to you about Bessy.
Daryl sat down on a chair, picked up the tea that the secretary had poured for him, and narrowed his eyes.
Are her computer skills good? She knows a little.
David also sat down. He had heard everything he knew from Grace. As for restoring the surveillance footage, it might seem extremely fascinating to normal people, but in front of people who knew how to do it, it was very average. Daryl raised his head.
Lindsay wants her to enter the Grant Corporation. I just don't think she's such a polite person. Chairwoman Grant wants her to enter the Grant Corporation?
David was a little shocked and even paused.
Then, did she agree?
Lindsay's invitation held great importance. In the long run, there were excellent developments and rare opportunities given, so most people wouldn't reject it.
I don't know. Chairwoman Grant didn't mention it to her.
Daryl was silent for a moment.
So, I want you to pay attention to this matter. I don't think she'll reject it.
The two of them talked for a while before Daryl stood up.
Oh yes, give me a copy of her details.
David had received details of Bessy's background when she had entered the Smith family. While Daryl waited for the documents in the lounge, he even asked David for Grace's phone number and called her. At this moment, Grace was sitting on the sofa with a stunned expression. "Mom, what did Grandpa say?" Anne poured a cup of tea and asked when she saw Grace's stunned expression. Grace was still holding the phone and only returned to her senses after a while.
"He asked me about Bessy."
Grandpa Smith hadn't mentioned it, but Grace had caught the main point. He was especially concerned about Bessy's decision to join the Grant Corporation. About Grant Corporation? Anne pursed her lips and spoke unintentionally.
Yes.
Grace was absent-minded, but her heart was beating fast.
Chairwoman Grant wanted to hire your sister, so Grandpa told me to tell her about it.
Anne turned sideways and gripped the cup in her hands. Then what did she say?
I don't know. I'll ask her tomorrow at the hospital.
Grace put away her phone. She was smart and knew that Bessy wouldn't pick up even if she called her. Oh, Anne pursed her lips distractedly, but she felt very irritable. What if Bessy agreed? Marvin and Harvey had already set off.
Is this the ward?
Harvey looked up and confirmed the information, then looked up and asked Marvin. Marvin's face was stiff as he nodded sullenly.
I already told you that Bessy would come to find Michael.
Harvey chuckled. Marvin didn't speak and just lowered his eyebrows. There was a suppressed atmosphere around him as he raised his hand to knock on the door. Although he didn't say it, Marvin was still disappointed with Bessy and was in low spirits.
Don't be disappointed.
Harvey raised his hand and patted Marvin's shoulder, comforting him.
Not everyone is like your goddess. We're just accustomed to your goddess. However, Bessy is still better than ordinary women, so don't expect too much from her.
The two of them were talking. The door of the ward opened. A woman of about 40 years old with short hair came out in high heels, with her eyebrow raised sharply. Yes? Episode 75. Will Bessy pass?
Miss Grant, hello. We're here regarding your son's fight.
Marvin just opened his mouth when he saw the woman's expression change. She said politely, "Oh, so you're Miss Miller's friend. We intend to bring that stupid boy over to apologize to Miss Miller tomorrow. We just don't know if she has the time." Marvin exchanged glances with Harvey, and they both fell into an inexplicable silence. Marvin had come over to help Bessy settle this problem. He hadn't thought much when he first knew about it, but now that Harvey mentioned it, he compared the two of them. He had been thinking about Harvey's words while on the way here. Naturally, he thought far more than that. Their connections in Evanston were far deeper than in Chicago, so Marvin thought about how much trouble Bessy would cause in Evanston. Marvin didn't expect Lindsay's reaction.
Apologize.
Marvin cleared his throat. Lindsay's judgment of people was good for her to be able to become the chairwoman. She could tell at first glance that Marvin and Harvey weren't locals and they weren't ordinary. She thought about it and associated them with Bessy. This is all a misunderstanding. I have already explained it to Miss Miller this morning. Lindsay smiled. Harvey was stunned and turned to whisper to him.
How could it be?
Excuse us. Marvin turned back and nodded to Lindsay. He saw that Harvey was still in shock. Marvin directly dragged him away. Harvey returned to his senses when they arrived at the elevator. He wiped his face and looked at Marvin a little awkwardly.
How did she know Lindsay?
They didn't know that Bessy had already resolved this matter in the morning. Marvin didn't speak. He also didn't know.
Who is it?
Antonio was playing with his phone in the ward, with his head lowered. Lindsay was deep in thought. Miss Miller's people. At the mention of Bessy, Antonio had a toothache. What was more desperate than provoking someone who was more powerful and had a bigger background than him?
That Anne said that Bessy didn't have any background, and I wanted to be the hero that saved the beauty.
Antonio frowned.
Who knew that she would beat me up too?
Lindsay stood by the bed, took out a cigarette from her cigarette case and looked at him sarcastically. I could tell that Anne isn't a good person at first glance. Now you've learnt your lesson. Antonio was a little depressed. Then he glanced at Lindsay.
Dad is here.
Lindsay smothered the cigarette extremely skillfully and threw it into the trash can. She turned her head and pointed to her son on the bed before complaining.
Antonio smoked.
Captain Gomez glanced at Antonio and said,
You don't seem like a 22-year-old at all. When will you learn from Miss Miller and stop causing trouble for me? Go back to Evanston tomorrow.
Antonio was exhausted and covered his head with a quilt.
Okay.
The school's medical office. Bessy was still asleep at 12:30 p.m. Samuel gave medicine to a boy who had been struck by a basketball. Michael was studying a set of silver needles inside the room. Marvin just brought back the meal from Hotel Kennedy Grand. Michael glanced sideways at Bessy. She was still asleep and the black blanket covered her chin. He had pulled the curtains apart just now to let some light into the room. Though it was still a little dark, he could see her drooping eyelashes and the shallow shadow under the bottom of her eyes. When she woke up, she was more obedient, but she was still frowning. Her complexion was pale and her lips were pale as well. Michael got up and crouched down beside the sofa, pulling the blanket off her.
Bessy,
he called softly.
Get up.
He deliberately lowered his voice and said with his usual lazy tone. But it was also like a gentle breeze blowing across the lake, rippling the surface slightly and unknowingly warm. Bessy's sleep quality hadn't been good, and she had kept dreaming infinitely, even when asleep. There was only endless darkness in her dreams. It was filled with violent blood and corpses everywhere. While in a hazy trance, she seemed to hear an echo in her ear. The deliberately lowered voice echoed in her ear and collided with her dream, causing it to shatter instantly, like a broken mirror. Bessy opened her eyes groggily. She saw a somewhat enlarged face in front of her. She recognized that it was Michael and sat up. What time is it? Her voice was husky because she had just woken up. Michael lowered his head and handed her phone to her.
It's 12:30 p.m. Time to wash your face and have lunch.
Oh, Bessy yawned and slowly pulled the blanket back. She wanted to fold it, but Michael took it away. Michael threw the blanket directly aside and lifted his chin towards her.
Wash your face first.
By the time Bessy washed her face, Marvin had already prepared the meal. She stretched her hands lazily and pulled back a chair, but someone was one step ahead of her. Marvin pulled the chair for her and then helped her pour a cup of tea. He said in a buzzing voice,
Miss Miller, your tea.
Bessy had already felt Marvin's attitude change towards her when she came in the morning, but she wasn't very interested in it. She just didn't expect Marvin to change again when she woke up. Bessy glanced at him. Marvin blushed. Bessy smiled and looked away. She sat down, supported her chin and said slowly, Thank you. Bessy returned to English class after lunch. Michael looked up after she left and glanced at Marvin before asking casually,
How did things go?
Marvin lowered his head and was silent for a while.
By the time I went, Miss Miller had already settled it with Lindsay.
He stated the matter again. Then he pursed his lips. He had indeed been biased against Bessy when he first came. But after Bessy saved him last time, his prejudice had fallen. People always lived by comparing to each other, so he would often compare his goddess to Bessy subconsciously. He would always find shortcomings in Bessy. But now, after looking at it from a spectator's point of view, Marvin found Bessy to be rather fascinating. She was a normal high school student on the surface, but she knew Captain Gomez and Lindsay. He wouldn't have thought so much if Harvey hadn't been involved. Michael heard this and nodded, seemingly unsurprised.
I understand. You don't have to come here from tomorrow onwards. Just follow Harvey and investigate.
Marvin's expression changed, and he didn't dare to say anything. Samuel kicked the table and slid his chair back as he saw Marvin sag his head and walk out. He couldn't help but turn to him.
What were you talking about?
Michael narrowed his eyes and ignored him, deep in thought. Samuel didn't wait for Michael to answer and saw a short-haired girl carefully push the door open and enter from the corner of his eye. He recognized at one glance that it was Bessy's friend, Scarlett.
Are you sick?
Samuel turned, lowered his legs and sat upright. Scarlett lowered her head and looked in Samuel's direction. She only saw his pale jaw and replied softly, I'm here to buy medicine.
Medicine?
Samuel spun a pen in his hand and smiled.
What medicine?
Scarlett was silent for a long while before she said, Aripiprazole? Bessy said you had it. Samuel stopped spinning the pen. Aripiprazole was an antipsychotic drug. Scarlett clenched her hands tightly. Michael, who had been leaning on the side and talking to Marvin, raised his head and walked naturally to the medicine cabinet. He asked calmly,
"How many boxes?"
2. Scarlett lowered her head.
"Okay, sign here,"
Michael said in an extremely casual tone. He took out 2 boxes of medicine and threw it onto the table. Scarlett pursed her lips and lowered her head to sign her name. She took the medicine and was about to leave. Samuel heard her say, "Thank you," in a very shallow voice. The first class in the afternoon was an English class. Bessy took out the new materials she had bought before and put them on the table. Mary leaned over and asked, "Bessy, what did you do in the morning?" Bessy leaned against the wall and pulled out a lollipop. She replied casually, "Private matters." Mary had wanted to ask if it was something to do with Antonio, but she saw that she was okay and didn't ask. Mrs. Lewis walked in with the new materials. She threw the materials onto the podium and swept her eyes across the room. Everyone turned to page 37. When she saw Bessy, she frowned. She also had a lesson with English class in the morning and naturally knew that Bessy hadn't been there. After finishing a multiple-choice question, Mrs. Lewis said, "Your class's exam results are the worst amongst all of my other classes. The midterm exam is coming next week and there are still many people who aren't studying hard. Don't tell people that you're from Bright Bow High School, nor that I was your teacher when you're out." She spoke to the class, but her eyes fell on Bessy. English class wasn't the top class. Other than Kenneth, their results weren't particularly outstanding, and Mrs. Lewis only took 2 classes. One of them was her top class, science, and the other was English class. She was used to teaching the top 100 students in science and naturally disliked English class. While discussing problems, she would often say, "Nobody from science got this question wrong." English class was mostly used to it. Mrs. Lewis continued talking for a few minutes, and then English class ignored her. She finally ended her lesson while suppressing her anger. When she reached the office, she saw Mr. Scott smiling and couldn't help but ridicule him. "Mr. Scott, you should take better care of the group of students in your class. They're already in high school and still skip class. I already told you not to accept any random student." Mr. Scott explained to her calmly, "She didn't skip class. She took leave. Mrs. Lewis, don't judge a student with a biased opinion." He took out a piece of paper from the drawer and handed it to Mrs. Lewis. Then he took his lesson plan and went to class. He was extremely relaxed and not in the least bit stressed. "What's the difference?" Mrs. Lewis muttered under her breath. She stared at Mr. Scott's back and pursed her lips. "The last place in your class. Just look how suffocating your class is. It'll be a miracle if she can pass the exam next week." The other teachers in the office lowered their heads and didn't speak. Episode 76. Bessy's Power. It was Saturday. Bessy first went to find Bertha as usual. When she reached, Andrea, Pete, and Susan were already there. Bertha's expression was even more exhausted. Bessy lowered her head and cut an apple for her in silence. After a while, Grace pushed the door open and came in while carrying a pile of things. Andrea took 2 steps forward and took the things from Grace's hand. She saw that nobody was with her and asked, "Sister, where's Anne? She didn't come?" Grace smiled. "She's packing up at home. She's flying to Evanston tomorrow to visit her teacher." "Oh," Andrea smiled. "She will become a professional in the future. Anne is so promising." Susan sat on the stool in the room and looked forward. "Evanston is so prosperous. Second cousin is so impressive." Pete took the apples that Bessy had cut and placed them on the table. Then he sat down and looked down at his notebook. Grace was naturally happy to hear someone praise Anne. "Bessy." Grace stopped her when Bessy was about to leave. She lowered her voice and said, "I have a piece of good news to tell you. Chairwoman Grant wants you to enter the Grant Corporation. The Grant Corporation's business is much bigger than our Smith family's." Grace couldn't contact Bessy and knew that she would ignore her even if she went to the school. So, she had come to see Bertha to say this to her. "What Grant family?" said Andrea in surprise. "Isn't Bessy still in school?" "The Grant family is noble in Chicago. Their business is in Evanston, and Chairwoman Grant's brother is Mayor Grant." Grace smiled. She took a fancy to Bessy and wanted Bessy to join her business in the future. When she heard that the Grant family was bigger than the Smith family, Susan couldn't help but glance at Bessy, especially when Grace added the thing about Gerald Grant. Even Grace had been shocked when she heard about Gerald Grant, so Susan, who was just an ordinary high school student, was so shocked that she gasped. One heard the name Gerald Grant in the newspaper or on the news. Hearing from Grace that he knew Bessy shocked her. She always thought that Bessy's luck was as bad as hers. They were sisters, but Anne could live in a luxurious house and ride a luxurious car. But Bessy could only stay in a dilapidated town with Bertha. She didn't expect that she differed from what she had imagined. Bessy slowly poked a slice of apple from the plate and picked it up, ignoring Grace. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Grace wasn't bothered and persuaded Bessy gently. "Bessy, have you thought about it clearly?" Bessy bit the apple and poked another slice before she looked up and said, "No." Grace had thought that Bessy would go after she explained it so clearly. She suspected she had heard wrongly and slowly looked up at Bessy. "What are you saying?" Bessy moved her chair back, finished eating her apple, and threw the toothpick casually into the trash can. She repeated herself, "I won't go." Susan heard Bessy's answer and raised her head in surprise. She didn't expect anyone to reject this kind offer. She couldn't help but glance at Bessy and say, "Cousin, think clearly. There won't be another opportunity after missing out on this. The Grant family is in Evanston. How could you not go?" Grace was anxious and couldn't help but raise her voice. "Where can you find a better place in the future?" "Mom, persuade her." Grace knew Bessy wouldn't listen to her and turned to Bertha. Bessy ignored Grace and stood up. She looked at Bertha and said, "Grandma, I'll go back to school first." Bertha gently said, "Okay, be careful on the way." Bessy picked up her cap and put it on her head before lazily opening the door and walking out. Grace didn't dare to chase her. She just looked at Bertha incredulously. "Mom, why didn't you persuade her and just let her leave?" Bessy only listened to Bertha. If Bertha told her to go, she would. "She doesn't want to go," Bertha said lightly. "It's not a question of whether she wants to go. Do you know what kind of opportunity she just gave up?" Grace pursed her lips. "Even if she can get into a university, she might not enter such a gigantic business in the future." She knew Bertha doted on Bessy very much, and she thought Bessy behaved like this partly because of Bertha's indulgence. But she didn't expect Bertha to dote on her this much. Bertha coughed and was in low spirits. She felt exhausted and didn't have the strength to speak, so she simply said calmly, "Don't make a fuss. It's not the first time it happened." The teacher from Evanston had also come forward 3 times and had still failed to persuade Bessy to go to Evanston to study the violin. Her voice was low, but Grace heard it. She suppressed her anger and said, "Mom, what do you mean, make a fuss?" Andrea saw the two of them were going to quarrel over Bessy and immediately pulled Grace away. "Okay, sister, let it go." She took Grace's bag and pushed her out of the ward. Once Grace was gone, Susan stood beside Andrea and asked, "Mom, why do you think Cousin doesn't want to go? It's such a wonderful opportunity. If they had given it to her, she wouldn't have missed this opportunity to climb up." Pete glanced at her and said in an icy voice, "Why do you care so much?" Then he went directly to the elevator without waiting for Susan's reply. Grace returned home. Many people had come to see Anne because she was going to Elise's place in Evanston and paying an apprenticeship to her teacher. By the time they left, it was already evening. "You went to the hospital, right? Did you see Bessy?" David looked at Grace. Grandpa Smith was also concerned about this matter, so David just asked casually. Thomas put down his fork and looked at Grace. Anne sat on the side and raised her head after hearing this. She clenched the fork in her hands tightly, barely suppressing her inner jealousy. Anne felt a sense of crisis in the Smith family and Grace's recent attitude. Grace was sullen at the mention of this. She shook her head and said in a tired voice, "I told her, but Bessy didn't agree." David paused and looked at Grace. "She disagreed? Why? Is there no way for redemption?" "I don't know, but I'm aware of her character." Grace put down her fork. "If she's adamant about it, she definitely won't go. My mother doesn't want to persuade her either." Anne had been extremely vexed, but she suddenly felt much better after hearing this. She lowered her head to eat and couldn't conceal the smile on her face. It was fine as long as Bessy didn't go to the Grant family. David also had to report to Grandpa Smith, so after dinner, he took his phone to the study.
Her grandma is from the countryside after all.
Grandpa Smith was also surprised. He pondered for a while and implied that Bertha was short-sighted.
You can persuade her,
Grandpa Smith said after a pause.
You can recognize Bessy.
David didn't speak immediately. Last time, he had chosen Anne's side. He had told no one about this matter, so neither Grandpa Smith nor Thomas knew about it. With Bessy's temperament, she wouldn't come to the Smith family. David sighed and still didn't tell Grandpa Smith the details.
Dad, I have my plans.
It was Monday again. It was exam week and the atmosphere in the school was even more tense and serious than usual. All the teachers were also more strict. After class, some students in English class also reviewed their materials seriously. After the last class, Mary handed Bessy a note. Bessy was still reading the German poem that Marvin had ridiculed. She took the note and saw that it was Paul's handwriting.
Shall we eat at the cafeteria at noon?
She thought for a while and picked up her pen subconsciously with her right hand. She lowered her head and was about to write when she realized something was wrong, and quickly changed to her left hand. She wrote, "Okay." After class, Paul stood at the back door and waited to eat with Bessy. In the school cafeteria, they met Brian Jake, who had his hands in his pocket and was standing isolated. Paul was more familiar with him and was friendly as he knew Brian knew Bessy. All of his previous enmity had disappeared.
Brian, sit with us.
Brian was still in his sweatshirt. He looked at Paul and smirked.
Okay.
He was quite concise. Paul raised an eyebrow. In the past, he would have fought with Brian, but since he was Bessy's friend, he endured it instead. They sat together and ate a good meal. The 4 most popular kids in Brightbow High School, sitting together, caused a tremendous sensation in the cafeteria. Paul often played on the basketball court, and the students could see him often, but they rarely saw the other 3 people except on the forum. Kenneth rarely ate in the cafeteria and could only be seen at the school dormitory students' meeting. He used to watch Anne play violin, but she was on leave, so the students had fewer opportunities to see him. It was especially so for Brian. He took 2 consecutive long leaves after coming to Brightbow High School, and even after he came back, he was out of school often since he was a sports student and was rarely seen. As for Bessy, she was at the school doctor's office or the coffee shop. She usually left class later than others, and because of her title as the most popular girl in the school, many people went to English class to see her. But even when they went there, all they saw was a pile of books. She always hid her face behind the books and they could hardly see her. All the students were looking over. The 4 of them were accustomed to such gazes and were quite calm. However, Mary, sitting next to Bessy, was trembling, with her head buried. The cafeteria was quite noisy. Brian put his bowl on the table and sat down, then glanced subconsciously at Bessy. Bessy lowered her face and picked up her fork. Her expression was quite calm and didn't have the usual irritable look. Brian raised an eyebrow slightly. He didn't expect this.
I thought you didn't eat at the cafeteria.
He picked up his fork and chuckled lowly. Bessy nodded. It's not that bad recently.
How's your hand?
He glanced at her right hand. Bessy held her fork in her left hand, so she opened her right palm to show him. There was only a pale pink trace left on her palm.
It's healing quickly.
Brian sighed in relief.
It probably won't leave a scar.
He leaned closer to her ear and asked something in a low voice. Bessy shook her head, but before she could speak, Paul knocked on the table with his fork and asked,
What are you 2 talking so secretly about?
Brian looked up at him, but didn't reply. Paul snorted and took a bite of his potato chips. He picked up his Coke and lifted it towards Brian.
Brian, shall we let bygones be bygones?
He was talking about when they had fought because Brian had said that Anne didn't play the violin well. Brian paused for 2 seconds before raising his bottle of mineral water symbolically. Paul didn't hold grudges. After taking 2 bites, he asked Brian,
Hey, why did you go against Anne last time? Were you helping Bessy take revenge? No, I didn't know her then.
Brian replied.
Why did you suddenly say that Anne didn't play the violin well?
Paul put his hand on the table and wondered. Regardless of Anne's character, she played the violin well. Kenneth, who had been eating silently, heard this and also raised his eyes slightly. Brian glanced at him.
I wasn't lying. She doesn't play well at all. I've heard someone play 100 times better than her.
Who knew that Paul would want to hit him for speaking the truth? Paul was silent for a moment, thinking that Brian was just being perfunctory, so he said sarcastically,
Then you must have heard some fairy playing the violin.
Only Kenneth looked up and glanced at Brian. Episode 77. You're a high school student? On Tuesday, the weather was overcast and it was drizzling. Grace was putting on nail polish when she suddenly received a notice from the hospital.
What? What happened to my mom?
Grace's nail polish was knocked over. She called her chauffeur in a panic and drove to the hospital. David heard about Bertha's situation through Aunt Ruth, and because he couldn't leave for the time being, he told Thomas to take the lead first. When Grace arrived at the hospital, there were many doctors outside of Bertha's ward. Thomas was talking to Bertha's attending doctor.
You know that Miss Wilson has been using the medicine CNS that is still experimental and not on the market.
The attending doctor explained to Thomas.
But since yesterday, our hospital has run out of CNS sources. We discussed alternatives to Miss Wilson's medicine, but her body has been irradiated too much before, and most of the drugs won't have much effect on her. She won't be able to use CNS for a long time either.
Then what can we do? Grace stood beside Thomas and panicked.
Is Miss Miller not here yet?
The attending doctor couldn't see Bessy and couldn't help but ask. This confused Grace for a moment.
Who? Miss Bessy Miller.
The attending doctor remembered her.
She's still in school. It's useless to find her in this situation, and it will only distract her.
Grace was a little confused, but she still shook her head.
It's useless even if you let her come.
Thomas had stepped aside to call his college classmate. The medicine CNS was owned by laboratories in Evanston and could only be got there. It wasn't uncommon for people in Evanston to have it. The attending doctor didn't speak. He thought about it and still went to the office to call Bessy. Thomas had strong connections. He took the lead to find someone who could get the medicine, but because of the many procedures, it would take 3 days for him to receive it. The attending doctor came back after the phone call and finally told them the result.
I've told you before that Miss Wilson had been irradiated. She had been on the edge of organ failure, but had held on because of the medicine. Yesterday, there was no more of the medicine, so if we can't find it by tonight.
He didn't go on, but his meaning was obvious. They sent Bertha to the emergency monitoring room. Grace sat on a stool outside the room and hung her head blankly. Andrea quickly put away her things at hand and quickly came to see Grace sitting in a daze outside.
Sister,
Andrea's throat was tight and she choked.
What happened to Mom?
Grace didn't speak and just glanced at her blankly. Thomas was waiting for David to come over and was still in the corridor. He saw Grace and Andrea's reactions and couldn't help but sigh. He found the attending doctor and said,
Is it possible to delay it for 3 days? I found a friend who can get the medicine CNS in 3 days.
The attending doctor shook his head.
Her body is already strongly resistant to drugs, and no alternative medicine is possible.
Thomas still wanted to say something. He looked towards the elevator subconsciously. A thin figure walked over, with the hair on the front of her forehead wet and resting on her brow bone. She had been in a hurry and hadn't brought along an umbrella, so her clothes were drenched. She walked to the attending doctor and wiped her face with her hands. What else do you lack? Bessy did not have many contacts saved on her cell phone. Bertha's doctor's number was the first on the list. When she received the call, her mind began buzzing. She did not even have the time to explain herself as she left the class. She ran in the rain and arrived with water dripping off her hair.
Medicine, that's what we need.
The doctor took a step back subconsciously.
We initially thought that we could use another substitute medication, but your grandma's heart condition deteriorated just now. That's when we realized that she's resistant to the other medication.
The Smith family and Bessy paid up a lot of money, so the doctor had been using the CNS medication that was still being researched in the laboratories. It hadn't even an official medical name beyond its symbol CNS. They were out of the medication yesterday, so he used a substitute. Who would have known that Bertha was so adverse to other medicine?
There is stock in the capital, but it would take 3 days for the procedures to be done and all.
Thomas looked at Bessy and pursed his lips. Bessy thought, 3 days.
I can only guarantee her life for 5 hours. We need the CNS in 5 hours, or we can transfer Miss Wilson to a hospital in the capital. They have the resources, but the risk is that the transfer might cause infection.
A distance away, a few doctors came over and gave a conclusion after much discussion. Grace, who had been sitting right outside the antibacterial room, finally snapped back to her senses.
Then let's contact the hospital in the capital.
No, Bessy refused without hesitation. Grace, Andrea, Thomas, and the other people in the hallway looked at her in shock. Bessy slowly looked up. Her eyes were red and deep beyond measure. Her hair was all over her face from running in the rain, and her expression was as dark as the rain clouds.
Grandma cannot go to the capital.
Bessy scanned their faces one by one as she made her statement. Thomas thought for a bit, but couldn't think of another solution. He did not expect Bessy to be against this decision. Grace was stunned.
What are you saying? If she doesn't go to the capital, we're going to watch her die in Chicago.
Shut up! She won't die! Bessy turned away. Doctor, I'm counting on you for the next 5 hours. The doctor in charge looked at Bessy. Bessy always looked so easygoing, but now that she was distant, those eyes looked deep and even scary.
Then after the 5 hours, the patient.
One of the other doctors spoke, but the doctor in charge interrupted and said,
We can only keep her alive for the next 5 hours. Beyond that, it's out of our control.
Bessy reached for her cell phone in her pocket. I know.
No, doctor, don't listen to her. She knows nothing. We're going to the capital.
Grace was extremely anxious. The doctor handed an indemnity form for Bessy to sign. Bessy skimmed through it, found that it was all right, and signed on it. The doctor in charge took it back and said to Grace apologetically,
Mrs. Smith, before Miss Wilson fell into an unconscious state, she appointed Miss Miller as her first contact. We have to take Miss Miller's word for it.
With that, the doctors got to work to stabilize her condition as much as possible, temporarily.
Bessy, what exactly are you doing?
Andrea was furious.
She's your grandma.
Bessy avoided eye contact with her. She simply gave her a pat on the back. Little aunt, don't worry. Grandma will be fine. Andrea was still in her office wear. Are you sure? Don't worry. Bessy searched for a number on her cell phone and walked towards the elevator. Nobody picked up on the other end. Bessy stuffed her cell phone back in her pocket and took out the other thick, black cell phone. She clicked a few keys and 2 screens came on. If Harvey was here, he definitely would have recognized that this was like what Captain Gomez's technical personnel were holding. She scanned the surroundings and found an empty spot to put down the screens. Bessy immediately input the thumb drive and tapped away on the keyboard. Soon, a video appeared. Capital, 129 Detective Agency. Jared Covington was sitting in a meeting room, discussing something with a few other ordinary members. Even ordinary members of this camp were few and were rather highly regarded in the capital. There were even fewer higher-class members of the 129 Detective Agency. Each of them was the cream of the crop. A tab suddenly opened on the computer screen in front of Jared. Someone was using a fake account. He clicked the green button.
Taking a client's request.
He smiled, but right after that, he realized that the account had sent him a video, not a voice memo. As the founder of the 129 Detective Agency, Jared had witnessed much chaos in the outside world. And yet, his face was all red now, as he slammed the table. He was losing it as he watched the screen. It was a rainy scene, and there was a young girl in the video. He could see that her eyes were deep, her face fair, and even after being drenched in the rain, her features were exquisite. That girl was still in a school jacket that had Bright Bow High School printed on it.
Lone Wolf?
Jared lost his calmness. Lone Wolf was well known in the 129 Detective Agency. 7 years ago, during a hacker situation, Lone Wolf had beat 2 of 129's members. With that, Jared invited Lone Wolf. But he never expected Lone Wolf to be a female, and one so young at that. Over the next few years, 129 Detective Agency became more established and stable. The few higher-class members began guessing who Lone Wolf was. After all, this was the only person who used just one account consistently. They dug up old records of syndicates and alliances, but none of them matched Lone Wolf's identity. How was it possible? That was because they never guessed that this Lone Wolf was in a high school. It's me. This time, Bessy did not use the voice changer function on her headphones.
Do you know the medication CNS? My grandma's condition is critical. Hold on.
Jared had to recover from his shock. He remembered that Lone Wolf only ever listened to her grandma. He minimized the tab and searched for the keyword online. In less than 2 minutes, he got a result.
There are no stocks in the capital. The last batch shipped 2 days ago to the neighboring state. Clarissa Hale is there now. If she takes the earliest flight on first class, she can be there at about midnight.
It took time to get past all the checkpoints and such. Midnight. Bessy's eyes flickered. Give me Clarissa Hale's phone number. Seeing that Bessy urgently needed it, Jared did not say more. He sent a series of digits to Bessy immediately. What was the fastest way to get someone past all the checkpoints and customs? Faces flashed in Bessy's mind. She eliminated each one of them until only one remained. She took the other cell phone out and made a call. School. The school's medical office. Michael was leaning back in his seat, staring at an anatomy model. He still had a blanket on him when the phone rang.
What is it?
He straightened up as he saw the caller ID and picked it up. Bessy kept the heavy cell phone and her voice was hoarser than before.
Do you know how to get someone back in the city in the shortest time possible? Which airport?
Michael stood up immediately and hurled the blanket onto the couch with a serious expression. Bessy was quieter than ever before as she gave him a reply.
Give me the person's details. I can get him back in 3 hours.
Michael squinted. He immediately made another call after hanging up on her. Samuel saw Michael was going out and shouted, "Michael, umbrella!" Michael did not stop. Marvin quickly grabbed an umbrella and caught up with him. Samuel had never seen Michael like this, but he couldn't go along like Marvin. He had to help Michael man the counter. The sky was still gloomy. Dark clouds were hanging overhead, almost depressing. 3 hours later, at Chicago Airport, a 26-year-old lady in a dress alighted from the plane before immediately getting onto a helicopter. 10 minutes later, the helicopter landed on the roof of the hospital. Michael was waiting with an umbrella, with Bessy standing beside him. It was pouring, and the surroundings were rather misty. Clarissa Hale got off the helicopter. She went straight for the only female on the roof and exclaimed, "Whoa, you are just a high school student?" Episode 78. He did it for his girl. Clarissa Hale walked around Bessy. She couldn't believe this absurdly youthful face. "You're not real, right?" Bessy had her arms wrapped around her black jacket. Clarissa wanted to pinch Bessy's cheek, but before she touched her face, Michael interrupted.
"What are you doing?"
He didn't sound too friendly. Clarissa said nothing to him, but Bessy was already holding her wrist. "Have you got the medicine?" "It's here, don't worry." Clarissa glanced at Michael and paused. She then turned around and faced Bessy again, trying to maintain her smile, but Michael was looking at Clarissa with narrowed eyes. Along the corridor of the antibacterial room, Grace was sitting on the bench while Andrea was pacing up and down. It had been over 3 hours, and Thomas had just gone back to discuss the transfer to the capital. A few doctors were discussing in hushed voices.
"Is Miss Miller not back yet?"
The doctor in charge asked Grace and Andrea countless times. Andrea looked at the elevator but couldn't say a thing. Her mind was blank. Be it the CNS medicine or arranging for Bertha's transfer of hospitals, Andrea couldn't offer her help at all.
"Doctor, please get ready."
Grace was tense and her throat dry.
"We'll be preparing her to transfer."
Just as she said that, the elevator at the end of the hallway stopped on their level. Bessy was right in front, and her hair was not as wet anymore. She'd been slim all along, and she looked fragile and vulnerable under the black jacket. "Is this what you want?" Bessy walked straight to the doctor and handed him a test tube. The doctor in charge received it and saw that it was a white tablet, identical to the one they used. He looked at Bessy with many surprises. She got it in such a short time.
"It is."
The doctor in charge led the few other doctors into the antibacterial ward in a hurry. Grace and Andrea looked on in anxiousness. Clarissa smiled. "Don't worry, the medicine is safe." "Bessy, is your grandma all right?" Andrea's fingers were ice cold as she turned to look at Bessy. Bessy said, "She's fine, the medicine is already on hand." A while later, the door opened and a nurse emerged saying that her condition had stabilized. Everyone finally heaved a sigh of relief. Only then did Grace and Andrea notice the people who had come along with Bessy, including Clarissa, Michael, and a few others. Clarissa was in a floral dress and she had some interviewing equipment in her hand. She was carrying a black bag as well. Michael was standing slightly closer to Bessy, His slender fingers wrapped around his cell phone. He was quiet, and even though he wasn't as cold as Bessy, he still seemed unapproachable. The two of them didn't seem like ordinary people. When Andrea's emotions were more settled, she went to Bessy and asked quietly, "Who are these people?" "They're my friends. Don't worry." Bessy did not say more and turned to face Clarissa. "I'm sorry we had to trouble you to come all the way here." Bessy was less tensed up than before. "You must have other matters to attend to." "I'm just in charge of the on-site news." Clarissa looked at Bessy from different angles and then smiled. "All that matters is that your grandma is all right. If there's nothing else, I'll be getting a flight ticket to return now." "I'll walk you out." Bessy nodded. Clarissa turned around towards the elevator and pinched Bessy's cheek just before she left. "It's all right. Boss said for you to just take good care of your grandma for now. Call me if there's anything." There were fewer than 10 people in the core group of 129 Detective Agency. Having worked together closely for 7 years, their relationship was stronger than most others. There was no awkwardness between them, and no need for civilities. The rest of them were about 30 years old, while Jared was 40. Given his age, he could even be Bessy's dad. Bessy was over 10 years younger than most of them, so they naturally considered her first, no matter what happened. Clarissa was receiving calls from Jared about once every 5 minutes, all of which were him asking about Bessy's situation. He was like a naggy old woman. Michael glanced at Marvin and signaled for him to send Clarissa to the airport. Clarissa was on the way to the airport. Marvin did not know what went on, except that Michael spent a lump sum getting Clarissa to Chicago in a short time.
"Miss Hale, how did you and Miss Miller get acquainted?"
They didn't seem to cross paths. One was an on-site reporter who wore rather ordinary clothing. The other was a high school student in Chicago. Whether in terms of age or identity, they seemed unlikely to be friends. Clarissa seemed so approachable and friendly when speaking to Bessy, but now that she was talking to Marvin, she appeared rather cold and patronizing with her response. "Online friends. I'm out here covering some news and helping Bessy get some stuff." Marvin did not say more. Oh, so she was a reporter who helped Bessy buy some things. At the airport, Marvin stopped the car outside as he watched Clarissa leave with her black bag. The bag looked familiar. Marvin thought for a long time and finally recalled seeing Bessy carrying a similar bag before. He looked at Clarissa's back view and found something odd about her, and yet he couldn't pinpoint what it was. Bessy had many friends: Captain Gomez, Mayor Grant, Lindsay Grant, and all of them were big shots in their industries. Now she even had a reporter as a friend. They were all rather weird. She was just a high school student. How did she know such people? His cell phone rang and he saw that it was Michael calling. Marvin picked up the phone and drove back immediately, putting this thought about Clarissa aside. At the airport, Clarissa gave Jared a call. She put on her earphones and said, "Boss, I saw Lone Wolf in person. I can barely hold myself together." Lone Wolf. A lone wolf was such a brutal animal, such a manly name. And it turned out to be a girl under 20. If the rest found out, they'd surely be shocked. Jared heaved a sigh of relief when he heard that they had safely delivered the medicine. He crossed his legs and sipped his coffee.
"This is rather weird. How could they divert the medicine suddenly to another state? I suspect someone is targeting Lone Wolf's grandma."
Why would anyone target an old lady? Clarissa went to look for some iced soda.
"That's hard to say."
Jared had already delegated this task. Given 129's capability, they'd be able to find the person behind this if it truly was intentional. "Thank you. A Coke, please." Clarissa paid the cashier and went on. "Oh, I forgot to tell you something. Do you know why Lone Wolf suddenly accepted a request last time?"
"Tell me about it."
Jared found something off about it. Lone Wolf was, as the code name suggested, much of a loner. She could go missing for a year and nobody could find her. The last time she appeared out of the blue, there was some trouble as well. Clarissa received her Coke and took a big gulp. After settling down, she explained, "Because the partner of the person who made the request has something going on with her." At the hospital, Bessy went to see Bertha first. Michael did not follow her in. He went to look for the doctor in charge instead. The doctor had seen him around Bessy and did not hide Bertha's condition from him. Michael was a doctor as well, so he knew how dire a situation Bertha was in. But he was a heart surgeon. He could only help if Bertha had a problem with her hardware. For natural processes like aging and deterioration, he could not reverse them. He knew Bessy had been coming to the hospital a lot, and they'd bumped into each other several times here. But Michael had never specially checked out on her, and this was the first time he was hearing about Bertha's condition. Only now did he know that her doctor had been using medicine from the research lab for Bertha. Not only was it expensive, but they rarely released it for public procurement. How did that reporter get a hold of it? Michael stuck a cigarette in his mouth but did not light it. He was deep in thought. Someone knocked on the door. It pulled Michael out of his train of thoughts. He turned around slightly and saw Bessy standing by the door. She whispered, "My grandma is awake. I need to thank you personally." Michael simply acknowledged with a and tossed the cigarette into the bin. He then thanked the doctor and got up from his seat. Bessy's hair was still a little damp, but her clothes were mostly dry. She looked up at him, her face a little pale.
"Are you cold?"
Michael touched the back of her hands and realized they were. Bessy sniffled but shook her head. "I'm not." She'd been out of sorts the whole day and was practically numb to the flurry of events. Only now, with everything settled, did she notice that she'd been sweating. She brought Michael into Bertha's ward. Bertha had just woken up and wasn't in a wonderful state.
"It's Mr. Clark who saved my life, yes?"
Bertha struggled to sit up as she saw him enter. Michael stopped her and respectfully said,
"It wasn't much."
Grace gave David a call. Andrea poured a glass of warm water for Michael. She was still in her work clothes and appeared uncomfortable as she handed him the water. Michael politely received it and thanked her warmly. With his pleasant disposition, Andrea's earlier discomfort dissipated as well. Her impression of this handsome man improved.
"Hold it."
Michael said something to Bertha before handing the water to Bessy. Bessy was by the bedside, and she shook her head. "I'm not thirsty."
"Warm your hands,"
Michael said calmly. Annoying. Bessy looked up at him and then accepted it. Her hands slowly warmed up. Bertha sat in bed and looked at Bessy.
"Bessy, you must have skipped your classes to come here. Go back to school first. Grandma is fine now."
It was rather a coincidence. As the two of them left, the Smith father and son duo arrived. Andrea poured Bertha another cup of tea and couldn't help but find something odd about it. She did not give it much thought. Grace brought David and Thomas in to see Bertha and leaned over the bed agitatedly.
"Mom, you're awake now."
Bertha was still rather groggy.
"I'm fine."
She turned to look at David and Thomas apologetically.
"Sorry to have troubled you to make this trip."
David simply said,
"This concerns your health. It was Bessy who took charge and took care of it. We did little."
Seeing Bertha's fatigue, David and Thomas did not stay for long either. As they left the ward, David frowned and asked,
"The CNS medicine is still undergoing research. It should be almost impossible to get a hold of it. How did she do it in such a short time?"
Thomas shook his head and said,
"According to Grandma Bertha, Bessy's friend had it."
This wasn't a restricted drug previously. One could get it as long as he was rich enough.
"Is it? She must be so lucky,"
David exclaimed. This was a rather logical answer, and they couldn't find a loophole. Bertha was an honest country lady. She wouldn't lie. They didn't dig into it. Never would they have thought that Clarissa had snatched it from a big boss outside of the state, and that Michael was the one that gave the green light to bring Clarissa to Chicago directly. An ordinary black car was parked outside Brightbow High School. Marvin saw Bessy as she walked into the building and exclaimed,
"Miss Miller's friends are all so poor."
Michael looked up and raised his brow.
"The medicine in that reporter's hand was developed in the capital's first research institute."
Episode 79. I'll do well for you guys. They hadn't known each other for a long time, but it was long enough. Michael knew that if Bessy wasn't at her wit's end because of the urgency, she wouldn't have contacted him. He hadn't even asked her for her reasons and had immediately used his network and resources to get Clarissa in. The doctor in charge told him what the medicine was. He'd inspected the test tube and recognized the logo. Marvin, who'd thought that Clarissa was just a friend who helped her get something on the way, was speechless.
"Any medicine developed by First Research Institute wouldn't come cheap. Even a jab costs thousands of dollars."
Michael gave a light cough before slowly explaining. He'd been in touch with that institute before and knew the market rate. Marvin was completely stunned. He didn't know what to think about Clarissa, who'd gotten such an expensive medicine on hand, but dressed so ordinarily.
Then how did she get a hold of it?
Marvin looked in the direction where Bessy had now disappeared from and started the car again. Michael whispered,
I don't know.
That Clarissa was a young woman who dared to report firsthand, on-site news, and was free to move about as she wished, already proved that she wasn't an ordinary reporter. Bessy knew Mayor Grant and some others, but it was only Clarissa's identity that was odd. Michael couldn't help but knit his eyebrows together as he thought about how they might know each other.
According to the reporter, she and Miss Miller are online friends.
Marvin stopped the car in front of the school doctor's office.
Miss Miller had helped her before. I think Miss Miller's technical skills are rather good. Maybe she'd helped her out in that before, so she was willing to make the trip to Chicago this time.
There was logic and there was evidence to it, which was rather convincing. Marvin himself was convinced, because he would never have thought that he'd just met two of 129 Detective Agency's core members. Michael glanced at Marvin and paused, remaining silent. Samuel had been on a shift in the school doctor's office the whole time, but he'd given Marvin a call at one point, so he knew roughly what was going on. Now that there were no patients, he took his laptop out and checked on some data. Seeing that both of them were back, he excitedly said,
Michael, do you know what I'm looking at now?
Michael poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the table, not responding. Samuel realized he wasn't enthusiastic about it, but went on anyway.
129 Detective Agency is looking for new members soon. They're probably going to recruit one this time.
Michael was still thinking about Bessy's incident and wasn't paying much attention to Samuel initially, but his words caught his attention. He narrowed his eyes.
Recruiting? Yep, I wonder who it'll be this time.
Samuel turned the screen to face them.
It's just one person. I bet those in the Capitol are going mad for that spot.
The 129 webpage was gloomy black. The 129 Detective Agency recruited members every year, but only the most ordinary class ones. But everyone was dying to get selected.
Then it surely is my goddess.
Marvin couldn't suppress his excitement.
If she takes part this year, 129 would surely pick her.
Samuel thought about it seriously and turned to Marvin.
If it's her, that's possible. It must be.
Marvin couldn't control his emotions.
The people of 129 are way too mysterious. They never ever show their faces. If my goddess becomes a member there, I might just be the first to find out. Maybe I'd even be able to get Lone Wolf's autograph, or they could just invite me to some internal event. Just look at you.
Michael glanced at Marvin and said casually. He then turned away and went to analyze his anatomy model. Meanwhile, Bessy was back in her bedroom. She removed her jacket and placed it on the bed, then grabbed a clean set of clothes to shower. She noticed that there was one more potted plant among the potted plants by her bedside. This one was a red flower that brought about a faint fragrance. Bessy paused and stood by her bedside, looking at that flower. She stroked the petals and smiled before taking her towel and going to the bathroom. It was past 4 in the afternoon when Bessy finished showering. She went to class right away. She'd planned to go to class straight after getting out of the car, but Michael suggested she showered and change up first. She wasn't too lucky. When she reached her classroom, they had not ended the second-last class of the day, and it was Mrs. Lewis's English class. Bessy wasn't in her jacket. She was wearing a t-shirt on the inside and a checkered flannel on the outside. She'd just showered, so she left the flannel unbuttoned. Her hair was also rather messy, and she hadn't had the time to comb it. She stood at the door and raised her hand. Reporting. Mrs. Lewis was rather patronizing when she taught in the classroom. The students weren't quite attentive, and upon hearing another voice, they turned towards the door. Bessy is back? Someone said in surprise. Some discussions began going about in the class. Their voices drowned out Mrs. Lewis's. Mrs. Lewis slammed a book onto the table. She had always disliked Bessy. Anne, the ace of her class, had deferred her from school term because of Bessy. As such, Mrs. Lewis was biased against Bessy. Seeing that it was her at the door, Mrs. Lewis lost her cool.
Bessy, you again! Stand outside and don't come in!
Bessy was a little stunned. She had not let Mr. Scott know when she left school. She only called him when Clarissa arrived, but she did not bother saying more to Mrs. Lewis. She simply turned away with her hands in her pocket. She wasn't intending to attend her lesson anyway.
Teacher.
Paul raised his hand from the last row of the classroom.
Bessy applied for leave before she left. She didn't break any rules or have any disciplinary issues. It isn't nice to leave her standing outside like that."
The moment he said that, the other guys began chiming in. Bessy was pretty popular in her class. The others backed Paul up.
"That's right, teacher. Bessy did nothing wrong. Let her in. It's freezing and windy outside."
The students of this class were mostly those whom other teachers didn't want or didn't like. The teachers simply pushed them all to Mr. Scott. Besides Kenneth, there wasn't another outstanding student in the class. Mrs. Lewis was extremely upset at the class. Seeing that they were going against her, she said sarcastically,
"Why, do all of you want to stand outside with her? Anyway, it wouldn't make a difference whether you're in class for the lesson."
The voices quietened.
Screech!
Paul dragged his chair and walked towards the door. He did not bring his English textbook or papers and only took his cell phone with him. With him taking the lead, a few other students in the back row, who were unhappy with Mrs. Lewis, got up as well and headed for the door. Anyway, those in the back row were the rather playful ones. Mrs. Lewis glared at them.
"Everyone who gets out of my class today, stay out of my lessons for the rest of the year."
Initially, the other students weren't thinking of acting on it, but after hearing her last statement, Mary glanced at Mrs. Lewis and put her book down. She got up and said, "Reporting. I want to go out too." With that, she walked out the door. "Reporting.
Reporting."
One after another. It was cloudy and rainy outside. Bessy was sitting in the hallway, not bothering much about what had happened. Then, she saw her classmates coming out one by one. She couldn't help but close her eyes for a bit and sigh. They must have lost their minds. It wouldn't be a big deal if it was just Paul, Bessy, and a few others, but a good half of the class was in the hallway now. Things weren't so simple anymore. Mrs. Lewis was fuming.
"Fine, since your class is so united and so smart, I won't be able to teach you either. I think you people don't need me."
She tossed her books aside and went to the staff room to look for Mr. Scott. It was a huge ruckus over at the English class, and a few other teachers had come out to look. Mr. Scott arrived quickly. He pushed his glasses against his nose bridge and said seriously,
"Mrs. Lewis, talk things out calmly. Don't pit yourself against these students. They're all already in senior year. What you're doing would affect their examinations and their future. Bessy's grandma was in an emergency. She'd already notified me in the afternoon. It isn't her fault."
Mrs. Lewis was a very ambitious person, and she looked down on most of the English class students.
"Future? What kind of future can your class have?"
Her gaze landed on Bessy as she scoffed.
"Mr. Scott, won't you just look at your class? What future?" "Mrs. Lewis, please don't be rash."
Mrs. Lewis was the best English teacher in Bright Bow High School. Upon hearing that, a few teachers tried to advise her. Mrs. Lewis did not like to be told what to do. She immediately got the director here. She did not want to continue teaching this English class. She was already upset when Principal White got her to take Bessy in, but it was only after Mr. Scott took her into his class did she remember she taught his class English. The director came quickly. Mrs. Lewis was one of the important teachers in the school. The director was caught in a fix of whether to let her change classes. There were few English teachers in Bright Bow High School and even fewer for 12th grade students. There were 19 classes in 12th grade and only 10 teachers to go around. The director looked at Mr. Allen, who was a bespectacled man. Bessy was more well known in the school than Kenneth. This Mr. Allen had heard of Miss Lewis's teaching skills as well. If Mrs. Lewis couldn't help the class, he didn't think he could either. He wasn't one of the best teachers, but he didn't want to end up becoming the worst after seeing their students' results. If this was the best class, other teachers would fight for them too.
"Mr. Scott, I'm sorry, I already have 2 classes on hand now."
Mr. Allen looked at Mr. Scott apologetically. Mr. Scott looked for a few more English teachers, but none of them agreed to it. Eventually, only Mrs. Wilson agreed. Mrs. Wilson was even younger than Mrs. Lewis. She was only 28. The other teachers expressed little, but they thought of Miss Wilson as a young idealist who didn't know the real world yet. Mrs. Lewis was very relieved to be rid of the English class. But seeing Bessy's expression at the last moment, she felt a little unsettled, as if she'd missed something out. However, she brushed that thought off quickly. She'd seen Bessy's file. She'd taken a year off school, and there couldn't have been much she remembered. Before that 1 year of leave, her results were already terrible. English class. Bessy was still quiet. Paul made a few jokes, but Bessy was expressionless, as usual. He turned away and walked back to his seat instead. The next period was self-revision. Everyone just buried their heads in the books to study. Not a single person said anything. Bessy was usually sleeping with her earphones on or reading a novel. But this time, it was all quiet during the lesson. Mary turned around to Bessy. "Bessy, you—" Bessy turned around and smiled lazily, as usual. "I'm studying." Mary was confused. Bessy leaned back and looked at the script in her hands. Without looking up, she said, "I've decided to make use of this examination, to shove it in Mrs. Lewis's face." Episode 80, On Her Way to Becoming a Nerd. Mary looked at her and kept quiet for a while. She then patted her on the shoulder. All the best." She continued doing her revision, but would turn around to check on Bessy once in a while. Bessy rendered her speechless. Soon, Paul passed a note down from the back. He was asking about what was wrong with Bessy. Mary looked at the note and wrote a reply expressionlessly. She turned around and passed it back to Paul.
"Guys, we were so cool."
The back row students were so proud of themselves.
"Mrs. Lewis, I just want to thumb her down."
The best class was the top 100 students in the school. They had a sense of superiority over the other classes. Even Mrs. Lewis herself despised the rest and often said, "Our best class would—" The English class had resented her for the longest time. Now that they got her out, everyone was more than happy. Paul put his pen down and opened the folded note. Mary wrote, "She said she wants to study and do well."
"Are you all right?"
Paul's deskmate asked him. Paul shook his head. How could he be all right? Mrs. Lewis had agitated her so badly. Miss Wilson only took the 19th class and a humanities class in 11th grade. Now that she had the additional English class, they moved her cubicle to the 12th grade teaching building. It was a Tuesday. It was the first time Miss Wilson was going to the English class for lessons, so she was a little anxious. The other teachers in the staff room had offered a few words of concern. "The kids in the English class have pretty good brains," a physics teacher said with a thermos flask in her hands. "They're willing to listen in class too. Mary is rather smart and improves fast." The physics teacher was sharing her experiences with Miss Wilson. Recently, the physics results of the English class had improved tremendously. Miss Wilson listened attentively. Mr. Allen, who'd turned Mr. Scott down the previous day, said,
"Miss Wilson, don't be too nervous. You've got 3 renowned students in your class. Not a bad thing."
Even Paul alone was hard to manage. Mrs. Lewis was so angry, she left the class. If Miss Wilson wanted to take them in hand, it'd be hard. Miss Wilson arrived at the English class. To her surprise, they were all silent and doing their work when she entered. Miss Wilson intuitively turned towards Bessy. Bessy hadn't been in Brightbow High School for a long time, but word about her abounded. Her bad temper was the most common. Max Hughes, from the English class in 12th grade, was the other one. The 3 renowned figures of the school studied in one class. Bessy sat by the window leaning against the wall slightly. She was looking down, so Miss Wilson could only see her side profile. She was exceptionally pretty. She had her pen in her left hand, and on the table was a very popular English resource material. She was wearing the school jacket, which many others were unwilling to wear. Overall, she looked obedient. But given that an important teacher like Mrs. Lewis couldn't take them in hand, Miss Wilson had a cause for concern. Miss Wilson found that the students of the English class were not as rude as she expected them to be. They were listening attentively in her class. Even Bessy, the big boss among the students, was listening. She also noticed that, besides Kenneth, Mary's English knowledge was the best. After the class, a few students even went up to Miss Wilson to ask her some questions. Miss Wilson cleared her throat and answered them one by one. Only when the next period started did she leave the class and head for the staff room. What happened to the horrible, inattentive English class? What happened to Bessy, who was always sleeping or reading other novels? Wasn't this completely different from what everyone had told her? The teachers in the staff room were chatting and couldn't resist asking a few questions when they saw her return. Mr. Allen was marking some English papers. Seeing that Miss Wilson appeared rather confused, he felt fortunate that he didn't have to be put through it, but he consoled her anyway.
"English class is like that. Miss Wilson, don't worry too much about them.
The weather was quite cold that day. Miss Wilson poured herself a cup of warm water and held it in her hands. She mumbled, "No, the English class students were very obedient. They're attentive in class and they even have questions for me." Mrs. Lewis had been waiting in the staff room to watch Miss Wilson's reaction. Hearing what Miss Wilson said, Mrs. Lewis gathered her stacks of papers and headed for the best class. Before leaving, she said sarcastically, "Too stubborn to admit it." The English class students were playing games or sleeping in class. Listening attentively? Who was she bluffing? As for Paul and Bessy, they wouldn't even be bothered. Mrs. Lewis did not want her teaching award to be at stake because of the English class. It was obvious from the moment she refused to let Bessy into her class. The other teachers in the staff room also felt that Miss Wilson didn't want to admit the truth. Even though they were smiling on the outside, it annoyed them on the inside. Seeing their reactions, Miss Wilson decided not to say anything more. Anyway, they wouldn't believe her. Dismissal time in the afternoon. Bessy, Mary, and a few others went to the cafeteria again. It was only later in the afternoon did she remember that she'd forgotten about the school doctor's office and Michael since the previous evening. When she left at night, she went to the school doctor's office. Samuel was attending to a girl when she arrived.
"Come and get more painkillers when you need them. You can't leave your condition like this. Go to a dentist as soon as you can."
Samuel handed her 2 tablets of painkillers and wrote a medical certificate for her, asking her to go to a professional dentist outside of the school. The girl thanked him while holding one side of her face. Samuel removed his white coat when she left.
"Bessy, why are you here only now?"
Michael, who was sitting inside, looked up when he heard him. Bessy found herself a stool to sit on. "Well, our examinations start this Saturday. I was studying." Her cell phone rang in her pocket. She glanced at it and saw that it was Jared's message. Ever since they exchanged their cell phone numbers the previous day, Jared had been calling her directly instead of going through her false account. She figured Jared was asking about the situation yesterday and decided not to read it. She would look at it later instead. Samuel was getting his cell phone from the drawer and almost dropped it when he heard her. It was indeed rather shocking to hear someone who often scored 20 to 30 marks say that she was studying. Michael leaned back in his seat and encouraged her.
"All the best. Don't be too stressed out."
"I know." Bessy nodded. Samuel was speechless. How stressed out could she be? Were they mad? Then, some voices came from the door. One of them was Marvin's. He and Harvey came in. Harvey's face was stern and his voice loud. Marvin was looking at Harvey, surprised.
"Really?"
Marvin hardly spoke, and he often had a default expression. Samuel turned his cell phone on and asked,
"What is it? You seem excited." "Well..."
Harvey was about to say something when he saw Bessy. It was obvious what he meant. Bessy drank a cup of water quietly, wondering if she should leave. But Marvin went on anyway.
"My goddess signed up for it. 129 is recruiting her this time."
Bessy went completely silent upon hearing 129, and her fingers started tapping away on the table. Realizing that Marvin went on ahead and said it without a second thought, Harvey turned around and looked at Bessy. It had only been a few days. Why did Marvin change so much? He wasn't guarded against Bessy at all. Bessy continued drinking her water without looking up and did not react to Marvin's words at all. Harvey was slightly stunned. He found her lack of reaction strange. Then something came to his mind. Bessy was an ordinary 12th grade student. How would she know what 129 Detective Agency was? 129 was only known to a very select group of people. It was logical that ordinary people hadn't heard of it, and Bessy's reaction was normal too. But it would have been even more normal if she'd asked what 129 was about. The way Bessy was sipping her water quietly and keeping her head low, she seemed completely disinterested. Harvey simply filled Samuel in on the details. Only when they were having dinner did they discuss 129's recruitment again. Michael hadn't been in the capital lately. Now that something huge happened in the capital, everyone's eyes were on it. A few parties had already gathered their resources to check on 129. Samuel was pretty interested in it too. Only Bessy and Michael were eating at the table.
"No, Michael, how could you not be the least bit interested? Marvin's goddess."
Samuel was about to say something, but paused when he looked at Bessy. He then continued,
Marvin's goddess might be selected."
Michael gave a patronizing response. Samuel couldn't help but turn to Bessy when he heard Michael's response. He smiled. After they had all spoken, Bessy slowly said, "Over the next few days I'll be focusing on my examinations. I won't have much time." Bessy had found the address for Captain Gomez previously, so she'd been coming to the school doctor's office to settle some problems for them too. Samuel heard about it just now and wasn't too shocked. But having heard it for the first time, Marvin looked up slowly.
"Miss Miller, are you being serious?"
Of course. Bessy seemed to be in a good mood. Samuel and Marvin quietly watched her leave. It was perfectly normal for a 12th grade student to be studying hard to prepare for their final exam the following year. Harvey saw nothing weird about it. In Harvey's opinion, it was more inappropriate for her to have spent so much time hanging out outside of school.
"She said she's going to prepare for her examinations. What's with your expressions?"
When they finished eating, Harvey asked Marvin quietly,
"Aren't grades the most important thing to a student?"
Marvin placed his dishes in the sink and turned around silently.
"I've seen Miss Miller do her homework, and I've seen her exam papers as well. Her results should be pretty good."
After all, tons of rich and beautiful girls in the capital had gone after Michael, and he hadn't taken an interest in any of them. When he came over to Chicago and found out that Bessy existed, he found she was not comparable to the other girls pursuing Michael. Now that he had a better impression of her, he felt Bessy couldn't be all that bad. Otherwise, what would Michael see in her? It couldn't just be her looks. Marvin turned on the tap and looked at him.
The last time she got Michael to sign her papers, the highest score she got among all her subjects was a 38.
Harvey went silent. Strange.